So first, we want to recognize that we're on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. My name is Nicole Weedman, and I'm based in Calgary. Furthest to my right is Ahmed Hanafi from Montreal. Next is Kelly O'Neill from Toronto. To my left is David Lawless from Ottawa, Sushma Narasetti from Toronto, and Graham Anderson of Vancouver. And our report is titled Change in Motion: How Canada Can Shape a Low-Carbon Future Through Electric, Autonomous, and Shared Transportation. So imagine it's 2050. Your usual commute to work took 15 minutes. Now it takes an hour. You look to your left, the public transit system is completely empty. There's autonomous cars everywhere. But sometimes there's only one person in it. Sometimes there's nobody in it. And you're lucky to get to work this week. Last week, the road was flooded from extreme weather events from climate change. You finally get to work. You exit your car. It's smoggy and the air quality is poor. You walk into your office. You see all the power lines. And right when you're about to turn on your computer, there's a major blackout from all the increased use on the electrical grid. Is this the future that we want to live in? No, it's not. Our task force decided to research personal transportation. And specifically, we looked at 3 existing and accelerating disruptions: electric, autonomous, and shared vehicles. Now, the purpose of our work isn't to incentivize any of these disruptions. We're assuming that these disruptions are happening no matter what the adoption rates are. However, we have to recognize that these disruptions have very different potential impacts. So we need to make sure that the impacts, and those impacts can either reduce or increase greenhouse gas emissions. So we developed policy solutions to help steer these disruptions towards the most desirable impacts. Now, the reason why we picked transportation is because it accounts for 24% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Approximately half of that 24% is due to personal transportation. This is a growing issue. There are more people driving. We're driving bigger, more inefficient vehicles. But we also have to recognize that this is a very complex issue. Transportation is more than just moving is more than just moving goods and people within cities. There are so many other factors that should be considered: safety, preference, cost, convenience. We decided to structure our report through this formula. And we have 3 factors here: fuel choice, vehicle efficiency, and user behavior. And all of these factors impact total greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to make sure that the disruptions positively impact the greenhouse gas emissions. So as an example, autonomous vehicles might have a positive impact on fuel choice or vehicle efficiency, but a negative impact on user behavior. So we need to make sure that no matter the disruption, the total greenhouse gas emissions are decreasing.
So before looking at policies that impact personal transportation, it's really important to better understand the personal mobility system. And our group found that there are 3 fundamental disruptions that are underway and accelerating. The first disruption is the advent of electric vehicles. Last year in Canada, electric vehicle sales increased by more than 60%, partly due to incentives and rebate programs offered by provinces such as Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, but also due to the fact that buying an electric vehicle is much less expensive than an internal combustion car, especially over the lifetime of that vehicle. There are also impacts as electric vehicle adoption increases on the charging infrastructure required, such as EV charging across the country, to help alleviate the range anxiety and the fear that consumers have about electric vehicles, whether these fears are real or perceived. And then there's also the impact on the electricity grid as more and more people are charging and putting demands at different times of day. And so considering the different transmission and distribution of electricity is also important. The second disruption that we looked at was autonomous vehicles or self-driving vehicles. And they're already being tested on Canadian roads, but as a recent Senate report just announced or suggested, federal policy is still 15 years away. So it's already happening, and we need to do something about it, especially because this will change our personal mobility patterns in cities. As more affordable and convenient options of transportation become available, there's a risk that consumers will send their driver or self-driving car to run errands for them, or they'll choose to drive for longer distances, ultimately increasing the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, with this emerging technology, there's also a market that will be developed, not just for the vehicle themselves, but also to connect and integrate with existing public infrastructure. And the final disruption that we looked at was shared vehicles. Now, we're all familiar with, or probably familiar with how Uber has transformed ride-hailing and taxis in our major cities, and this is likely to continue increasing in a world of electric and autonomous transportation. And it's also potentially going to change how we own vehicles and use vehicles, especially considering that major car manufacturers are considering changing their business model to one of ride-sharing and car-sharing. There's also the potential for higher vehicle utilization and the potential that shared vehicles will take away from public transit use. So these are all important considerations. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there are significant opportunities with these disruptions, but also significant risks. And without comprehensive, responsible public policy, the developments that I've just mentioned could lead to very undesirable impacts, such as zero passenger use, increase in congestion, as well as declining revenue generated through things like gasoline taxes. And so it's important that these negative impacts are improved by public policy so that we can get to a better future, one where ride sharing is integrated with public transit, and so that we're reducing congestion and that revenue generated is still maintained despite people maybe switching to electric vehicles. But whether we have a negative or positive future ultimately depends on the people within that system. And so to better understand human behavior and how people react in the personal mobility sector, we organized a community engagement event in which we developed a innovative simulation-style exercise. And this simulation was based on similar exercises such as Newtonian shift, which was developed by a Dutch utility, and the poverty simulation developed by the United Way. And what this allowed young Canadians between the ages of 18 to 35 was to take the role of actors within that system. And whether this was car manufacturers or consumers or provincial governments, and make decisions. And we were ultimately able to refine some of our initial policy ideas through this feedback. But it was also important because it helped we encouraged participants to empathize with actors. And as a public servant myself, I must say that it's particularly nice to discover a new way of engaging the public, especially considering we received very creative ideas from participants and created meaningful connections. So I would highly recommend that the government consider using more empathy-driven tools to engage the public going forward.
So we are thinking long-term, that is 2050, and in order to have a meaningful impact, we need to act now. As we just heard, personal mobility systems are quite complex, and they require flexible and multifaceted policies to address the issues. So rather than propose a single policy that fulfills multiple roles, we are proposing a policy framework that comprises of 3 tiers: steer, accelerate, and protect, that would work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from personal transportation. Before we go into the details of these individual tiers and the policies under them, I want to make note of 2 points. First is that we are proposing a pan-Canadian framework that we envision being led by the federal government in partnership with the provinces, the territories, municipalities, and the indigenous governments. And the second point to note is that our proposed policies have an urban focus and context to them. We focused on the large urban centers, mainly because they are the most exposed to the rapid changes in the personal mobility systems. We do recognize that there could be a disproportionate impact on rural and indigenous communities, and as a result, unique policy recommendations and options are required, but they are beyond the scope of our research to address these equity concerns. So the first tier in the pan-Canadian framework is a set of policy recommendations that are aimed at steering consumer behavior to reduce or to make to select options to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. They're also geared towards maintaining sources of revenue for the government to ensure continued investment in infrastructure. As such, these policies are consumer-focused, and they have a predetermined increasing trends over a period of time.
We recommend 3 policy levers that could be used to steer consumer behavior for better outcomes. Our first policy lever is dynamic mobility pricing in urban areas. Congestion, infrastructure, and pollution costs are all externalities that are rarely paid directly by drivers. Mobility pricing shapes transportation demand to the time and routes that are less congested, while also generating revenue that can be invested in improved infrastructure. This model has been adopted successfully in leading global cities such as Hong Kong, Stockholm, and London, and we believe it will only become more necessary with changes in personal mobility that we're discussing today. Our next suggested lever is time of use electricity pricing. With current electricity pricing across most of Canada, customers pay the same price regardless of what time they charge. However, the real cost and greenhouse gas impact of generation changes dramatically depending on peak and off-peak timing and the type of fuel used. Provinces across Canada could instead adopt an approach similar to that taken here in Ontario, where electricity pricing fluctuates at different times of day. This approach can achieve better greenhouse gas outcomes while avoiding new generation and transmission investments. The final lever we have suggested in this tier targets the federal excise tax on high-polluting vehicles. Currently, this tax applies only to very few luxury vehicles. We propose to increase and broaden this tax so that consumers are discouraged from buying the worst-performing vehicles based on greenhouse gas emissions, again, regardless of fuel choice. New revenue would then be available to fund infrastructure investments or to provide incentives for low emissions vehicles.
And the second tier in our policy framework is a set of policy recommendations aimed at accelerating, supporting investments in innovation, mainly to provide consumers with more options to more rapidly reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, these investments would also be done in infrastructure to, for example, roll out charging infrastructure. And as such, these policies are more business-focused, and they promote a collaboration and a joint investment between the public and the private sectors.
Again, we recommend 3 policy levers to accelerate supporting investments. First, we recommend continuous improvement in fleet vehicle efficiency standards. Our current fleet efficiency standards are harmonized with the United States, with targets that gradually increase every year. As the US now plans to weaken their standards, Canada must continue strengthening ours to ensure that fleet-wide efficiency improvements improves consistently regardless of fuel choice. This policy has also been identified as one of the most cost-effective and politically acceptable options for supporting electric vehicle uptake, as it creates a direct benefit for automakers that sell increasing numbers of electric and low emissions vehicles. Our next recommended policy lever is the Clean Fuel Standard, and this type of policy has been in place in British Columbia since 2010. The federal government currently seeks to scale this policy across the country. This policy supports a transition to clean fuels while ensuring that all existing fuels reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by a reasonable amount each year. These reductions can be achieved by increasingly blending lower carbon biofuels into our fuel mix. And for the final lever in this tier, we support investment in innovative electric vehicle charging infrastructure by the Canada Infrastructure Bank and other government sources. This was one of the findings that was specifically supported by our public engagement activity, where participants playing the role of automakers and ride-hailing companies successfully leveraged a similar policy to develop new charging stations.
The third tier in our policy framework is a set of recommendations aimed at protecting against undesirable consequences from emerging technologies such as autonomous vehicles. We heard earlier how if the autonomous vehicles and the deployment is not managed well, it could potentially lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So these set of policies protect against those undesirable consequences. These policies are more stringent. However, they are less likely to be triggered in the near term.
Here, we suggest a proactive approach to regulating autonomous vehicles, given the particular risk of increased low or zero occupancy travel with these vehicles. Fundamentally, we believe that those operating autonomous vehicles or vehicle fleets will require clear operating standards, and that there are benefits to aligning these standards across jurisdictions as much as possible. And finally, we suggest that higher occupancy autonomous vehicle use should be encouraged by specifically targeting autonomous vehicle fleet operators and owners with clear incentives. We suggest that a system of additional levies for low or zero occupancy use, or tradable credits permitting a limited amount of lower occupancy time, could be 2 effective options for achieving this goal.
At the beginning, I painted a fairly dark picture of what our future could look like. But our future could look like this. As you can see, there's higher occupancy vehicles with less congestion, a continued investment in infrastructure, and most importantly, as it relates to our paper, lower greenhouse gas emissions from personal transportation. This possible future is within our reach. We now welcome feedback and questions. And to preemptively respond to any questions, Carol was the best mentor. We're very, very fortunate to have her. Thank you.